Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is presented strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. This video explores the complex anthropological, historical, and sociological frameworks of divorce in the United States, often referred to as the study of Anthropology 661. This information does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Family law, tax implications, and domestic relations vary significantly by state and individual jurisdiction. Because every personal situation is unique, viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal professionals, certified financial planners, or licensed therapists before making any decisions regarding their marital status or legal rights. Everything you think you know about the American divorce rate is likely a historical misunderstanding or a statistical ghost from the 1970s. We have been told for decades that 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in failure, a coin flip that determines the fate of the American family. But if you look at the raw anthropological data, the reality is far more complex and, frankly, more startling. We are currently living through a period that scholars call the Great Crossover, a massive structural shift where the very definition of a successful life is being decoupled from the traditional concept of lifelong monogamy. In the next few minutes, we are going to tear down the myth of the 50% divorce rate and look at why divorce in the United States is not actually an epidemic of failure, but rather a predictable, evolutionary adaptation to the modern economy. If you have ever wondered why your parents stayed together in misery while your peers are separating after 3 years, or why the wealthiest demographics in America are actually seeing a decline in divorce while the working class is seeing a collapse of the marital unit, you are in the right place. This is a deep dive into the hidden mechanics of American kinship, and by the end of this masterclass, you will never look at a wedding or a courtroom the same way again. The problem we are solving today is one of cultural literacy. Most Americans enter into marriage using a 19th century map to navigate a 21st century landscape. This discrepancy creates a massive amount of personal and financial trauma. We are going to provide you with the anthropological tools to understand the invisible scripts that dictate your relationship's potential outcomes. We are moving beyond the surface-level gossip of who left whom and diving into the systemic pressures, economic, biological, and historical, that make divorce in the U.S. a unique global phenomenon. This is the Anthropology of Divorce 661, and we are starting with the foundational shifts that changed the American household forever. To understand where we are, we have to look at the historical trends that led us to this moment. Anthropology teaches us that marriage was never originally about love. It was a property arrangement and a labor contract. In the early agrarian history of the United States, a household was a unit of production. You didn't get divorced because you weren't happy, or because your spouse didn't fulfill your emotional needs. You stayed married because the farm required 2 adults and a fleet of children to function. Divorce was a death sentence for your economic survival. However, as the U.S. transitioned into an industrial and then a service-based economy, the household shifted from a unit of production to a unit of consumption. This is the first major pillar of Anthropology 661. When individuals, particularly women, gained the ability to earn an independent wage outside the home, the exit cost of a marriage plummeted. We often point to the year 1969 as the ultimate turning point. This was when Ronald Reagan, then the governor of California, signed the first no-fault divorce law. Anthropologists view this not just as a legal change, but as a total redefinition of the American social contract. Before this, you had to prove fault, adultery, cruelty, or abandonment, to be granted a decree of dissolution. The legal system acted as a gatekeeper to the exit. Once no fault became the standard, marriage moved from a permanent status to a contingent contract. Case studies from this era show a massive spike in divorce rates throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, peaking in 1981. This wasn't because people suddenly became less moral. It was because the legal and economic barriers to leaving had finally caught up with the social desire for individual autonomy. Now let's look at the data that everyone gets wrong. You have heard that the divorce rate is 50%. This statistic is largely a projection based on the behavior of baby boomers in the late 1970s. If you look at the current potential outcomes for couples marrying today, the numbers tell a different story. For college-educated couples who marry after the age of 25 and have a stable income, the divorce rate has actually been dropping significantly. In fact, for this demographic, the likelihood of a marriage lasting 40 years is higher than it was for their parents. Conversely, for those without a college degree or those living in lower-income brackets, the divorce rate remains high or is even rising. This is what anthropologists call the marriage gap. Marriage is becoming a luxury good in the United States, and divorce is increasingly a byproduct of economic instability rather than personal incompatibility. To understand the anthropology of divorce 661, we must also examine the shift from institutional marriage to companionate marriage, and finally to the soulmate marriage. In an institutional marriage, you are looking for a partner to help you survive. In a companionate marriage, which dominated the 1950s, you are looking for a friend and a co-parent. But in the modern US, we have moved into the era of the soulmate marriage. This is an extremely high-stakes model where we expect our spouse to be our best friend, our passionate lover, our co-parent, our career coach, and our primary source of intellectual stimulation. Anthropologically speaking, this is an immense amount of pressure to put on a single human being. When a partner fails to meet just one of these criteria, the modern American perceives the marriage as broken, even if it is functional in every other way. This expectation of total fulfillment is one of the primary drivers of what we see in modern case studies regarding marital dissolution. Let's talk about the gray divorce phenomenon, which is a critical component of this study. While divorce rates are falling among younger generations, partly because they are waiting longer to get married or choosing cohabitation instead, divorce rates among those over the age of 50 have doubled since the 1990s. Why? Anthropology suggests this is due to the extension of the human lifespan and the changing role of women in the later stages of life. If you are 55 years old today, you might have another 30 or 40 years of active life ahead of you. The prospect of spending those 4 decades in a zombie marriage that no longer provides emotional growth is seen as an unacceptable potential outcome. This trend highlights that divorce is no longer just a young person's mistake, but a strategic choice made at every stage of the life cycle. Step by step, we have to analyze the mechanics of how a society moves from a high-stability, low-satisfaction model to a low-stability, high-satisfaction model. The US is the global leader in this transition. We prioritize expressive individualism, the idea that your primary duty in life is to become the most authentic version of yourself. If your marriage hinders that growth, the cultural script of the US now encourages you to leave. This is a radical departure from the kinship structure seen in most of human history, where the needs of the collective family or the lineage always outweighed the needs of the individual. As we move forward in this series, we will break down the specific rituals of divorce. Anthropology isn't just about the why, it is about the how. In the US, divorce has its own set of rituals, from the uncoupling announcements on social media to the division of the digital estate. We are going to look at how these rituals function to help individuals transition from one social identity to another. We are also going to look at the biological data, how the brain handles the severing of a long-term pair bond, and why the anthropology of 661 treats this as a physical trauma as much as a legal one. By the end of this part 1, you should understand that divorce in America is not a sign of social collapse. It is a sign of a society that has placed a higher value on individual fulfillment than on institutional longevity. Whether that is a good or bad thing isn't the point of this masterclass. Our goal is to give you the data to see the trend lines clearly. We are looking at a historical trend where marriage is becoming more selective, more difficult to maintain, and more focused on emotional parity than ever before. We have set the stage. We have defined the disclaimer, hooked into the reality of the shifting statistics, and promised a deeper understanding of the forces at play. In the next part, we will dive into the specific economic triggers that predict a divorce long before the papers are ever filed. Stay tuned because the anthropology of your own life is about to get a lot clearer. To understand the economic triggers of divorce in the United States, we have to look at the household not just as a unit of love, but as a microeconomy. In 2026, the American household is under more financial pressure than perhaps any generation since the Great Depression, but for entirely different structural reasons. The primary economic trigger we see today is what anthropologists call the divergence of marital capital. Imagine if you are a person named Alex living in a major U.S. metropolitan area. Alex and his partner Jordan both work in the service and tech sectors. In the historical trends of the mid-20th century, a single income could often sustain a household, creating a clear division of labor that actually served as a stabilizing force, however inequitable it may have been. Today, the dual income requirement has transformed marriage into a high-stakes partnership where any economic fluctuation for one partner directly threatens the survival of the entire unit. When we look at case studies from the early 2020s leading into 2026, we see a recurring pattern known as the stress contagion. This is a step-by-step process where external economic shocks, such as a sudden shift in the housing market or a tech sector layoff, move from the bank account into the bedroom. Step 1 is the contraction of discretionary spending. Step 2 is the increase in what anthropologists call cognitive load, where the partners spend more time navigating financial logistics than engaging in emotional bonding. Step 3 is the emergence of resentment, where the labor of one partner is perceived as less valuable if it does not meet a certain financial threshold. This process is one of the most reliable predictors of illegal filing long before any emotional infidelity or irreconcilable differences are cited in a courtroom. One of the most fascinating potential outcomes in the Anthropology of Divorce 661 is the relative earnings hypothesis. Historically, in the United States, if a wife earned more than her husband, the marriage was statistically more likely to end in divorce. This was a result of deep-seated cultural scripts regarding the male breadwinner role. However, by 2026, the data shows a complex shift. In higher-educated demographics, this earnings gap is no longer the trigger it once was. Instead, the trigger has moved to the stability of the income rather than the amount. We are seeing a new phenomenon where the gig economy and freelance volatility are creating a sense of precariousness that the American kinship structure is not yet evolved to handle. Consider the case study of a couple in Austin, Texas, whom we will call Sarah and Michael. Sarah is a high-earning consultant, and Michael is a freelance designer. In 2026, the fluctuations in Michael's monthly income create a constant state of negotiation within the marriage. This is what scholars call the transactionalization of intimacy. Every shared meal, every vacation, and every repair on their home becomes a point of economic debate. In an anthropological sense, the marriage has shifted from a covenant to a series of microtransactions. When the transaction cost of staying together, the emotional energy spent on financial negotiation, exceeds the perceived benefits of the partnership, the anthropological exit ramp is activated. We also have to discuss the role of debt as a primary environmental factor. In the United States, medical debt and student loan debt act as invisible third parties in millions of marriages. Data indicates that couples who enter marriage with high levels of consumer debt are significantly more likely to experience early-stage dissolution. This is because debt limits the couple's ability to build marital capital, which includes things like homeownership or shared investments. Without shared assets, the barriers to leaving are lower. This is a cold, mechanical reality of the anthropology of divorce. If there is nothing to divide, the process of leaving is physically and legally easier. In 2026, as housing prices remain a significant hurdle for the average American couple, we see more people choosing to cohabitate without marriage, effectively creating a pre-divorce state where the economic entanglement is minimized from the start. Another critical economic trigger is the concept of the consumption-based marriage. In modern U.S. culture, the success of a marriage is often measured by the outward display of a specific lifestyle. When a couple can no longer afford the lifestyle they have projected to their social circle, the marriage itself often loses its perceived value. This is especially prevalent in what we call the aspirational class. Imagine a couple who has built their identity around a specific type of urban living, high-end travel, and curated experiences. If an economic downturn or a career setback forces a retreat into a more modest lifestyle, the psychological fallout is often directed at the partner. The partner is no longer seen as a co-traveler in a grand adventure, but as an anchor preventing the other from reaching their desired social status. Step by step, the economic breakdown usually follows a specific legal and social trajectory. First, there is the separation of accounts. While many couples start marriage with joint accounts, the first sign of an impending anthropological shift is often the quiet reopening of individual accounts. This is followed by the reallocation of shared resources. In our 2026 case studies, we see that people often start investing more in their individual human capital, such as going back to school or taking professional certifications, as a way to prepare for a solo economic future. By the time the word divorce is actually spoken, the economic divorce has often been in progress for 18 to 24 months. The geography of the United States also plays a role in these economic triggers. In high cost of living areas like San Francisco, New York, or Seattle, we see a phenomenon known as the bird-nesting economy. This is where a couple chooses to legally divorce but continues to share a residence because neither can afford to live alone in the same city. This creates a strange anthropological limbo where the social contract is severed, but the economic contract remains intact. It challenges our traditional definitions of what a household is, and shows how economic necessity can override even the most intense interpersonal desire for separation. Furthermore, we must address the impact of the wealth transfer from the baby boomer generation to their Gen X and millennial children. In 2026, this massive movement of assets is actually functioning as a divorce trigger in some case studies. When one spouse inherits a significant sum of money, it changes the power dynamic of the marriage overnight. If the marriage was already on shaky ground, that inheritance provides the financial runway needed to leave. Anthropologists refer to this as the sudden autonomy event. The inherited wealth acts as a catalyst, accelerating a process that might have otherwise taken years to manifest. What we are witnessing is the total reconfiguration of the American family around the concept of individual financial security. The historical trends show us that as a society becomes more affluent and social safety nets become more focused on the individual, rather than the family unit, the necessity of marriage as an insurance policy declines. In the United States, we are in a unique position where the cost of living is high, but the cultural value of individual freedom is even higher. This creates a permanent tension that makes every marriage a high-wire act of economic balancing. If you think the financial triggers are the most complex part of this story, you are only seeing half of the picture. Money provides the means to leave, but the human brain provides the motive. Why is it that some couples can survive total bankruptcy and come out stronger, while others crumble after a single missed promotion? Why do we see some of the highest divorce rates among the people who have the most to lose? To answer that, we have to move past the bank statements and into the circuitry of the mind. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to explore the biological and psychological triggers of the 7-year itch, and why your brain might be hardwired to seek an exit exactly when things seem to be going right. We will look at the neurochemistry of long-term bonding and the shocking data on how the US environment is literally rewiring our capacity for lifelong commitment. The anthropology of divorce is about to move from your wallet to your DNA. When we move the lens from economics to the biological foundations of human pair bonding, we enter a territory where our ancient hardware is forced to run modern American software that it was never designed to handle. In the field of anthropology, this is known as the mismatch theory. Our biological systems for bonding evolved in small nomadic groups where survival depended on long-term cooperation. However, in the high-speed, hyper-digital environment of 2026, those same biological triggers are being hijacked by a culture that prioritizes novelty and individual gratification. To understand the anthropology of divorce 661, we must first analyze the neurochemical life cycle of a relationship. Every marriage begins with what anthropologists call the limbic high. This is the stage of intense romantic attraction characterized by high levels of dopamine and norepinephrine. In the context of the modern US, this stage is often extended by the performative nature of dating in 2026, where social media and digital interaction keep the brain in a state of constant reward seeking. But biology has a built-in expiration date for this phase. Case studies in evolutionary psychology suggest that this neurochemical cocktail typically lasts between 18 months and 3 years. This is not a failure of the couple, it is a physiological reset. The brain cannot maintain that level of high-intensity arousal indefinitely without damaging its own receptors. Once the dopamine fades, the marriage must transition to the attachment phase, driven by oxytocin and vasopressin. These are the chemicals of deep bonding, security, and long-term trust. However, in 2026, the American lifestyle is hostile to the production of these hormones. High-stress environments, constant blue light exposure from devices, and the erosion of shared leisure time lead to chronically elevated levels of cortisol. When cortisol is high, the body's ability to process oxytocin is inhibited. This creates a biological wall between partners. Imagine if you are a citizen named David, living in a suburban tech hub. David and his spouse are both working 60-hour weeks to maintain their standard of living. Physically, they are in the same house, but biologically, their bodies are in a permanent state of fight or flight. They are not bonding, they are surviving. Over time, this biological isolation makes the prospect of divorce feel not like a tragedy, but like a necessary relief for the nervous system. This brings us to the famous 4-year and 7-year peaks in American divorce data. Anthropologists have noted that in many cultures, there is a significant spike in marital dissolution around the 4-year mark. From an evolutionary perspective, 4 years is roughly the amount of time it would take for an ancestral human pair to conceive and raise a child to a stage of basic mobility where the child could be cared for by a larger kin group. Historically, this was the point where the biological imperative for that specific pair bond would weaken, allowing for new genetic combinations. In the modern United States, we see this ancient script playing out even when children are not involved. The 4-year itch is a biological echo of a time when serial monogamy was a survival strategy. By the time a couple reaches the 7-year mark, they are dealing with the psychological weight of the personality plateau. Imagine a scenario where a woman named Chloe in 2026 feels that her partner has become a stranger. This isn't necessarily because the partner has changed, but because the biological novelty has completely vanished. In the US, our culture of consumption teaches us that when a product no longer provides a dopamine hit, it is time for an upgrade. We apply this same logic to our biological partners. The anthropological data shows that Americans are more likely than almost any other nationality to view the loss of the spark, which is really just the transition from dopamine to oxytocin, as a valid reason for legal separation. We also have to consider the impact of what anthropologists call the infinite choice environment. In 2026, the presence of sophisticated, AI-driven social and dating platforms creates a constant background noise of alternative potential outcomes. Biologically, humans are not built to process thousands of potential mates simultaneously. This leads to a state of permanent search mode. Even within a stable marriage, the subconscious knowledge that other options are just a swipe away prevents the deep neurochemical settling required for lifelong attachment. This is particularly prevalent in the US, where the ethos of always improving is applied to every facet of life, including the person sleeping next to you. Step by step, the biological detachment process usually begins with the cessation of shared physical rituals. In an anthropological sense, grooming, prolonged eye contact, and synchronized movement are the ways primates maintain social bonds. In the modern American household, these rituals are often replaced by individual screen time. When a couple stops looking at each other and starts looking at their respective devices, the oxytocin feedback loop is broken. The brain begins to categorize the spouse as a roommate, rather than a mate. Once this categorization occurs, the psychological barriers to divorce begin to crumble. Another critical factor in the Anthropology of Divorce 661 is the role of testosterone and its correlation with marital status. Historical trends in recent 2026 data indicate that men in long-term, stable marriages tend to have lower testosterone levels than single men or men in the early stages of a relationship. From an evolutionary standpoint, this was a mechanism to encourage paternal investment in domestic stability. However, in a culture that increasingly values the alpha or high-performance male archetype, many American men feel a subconscious drive to re-enter the mating market to regain that hormonal surge. This creates a hidden biological tension where the stability of the family unit is at odds with the biological drive for status and vitality. Furthermore, we must look at the impact of the U.S. environment on the female hormonal cycle and how that interacts with marital satisfaction. In 2026, the delayed age of marriage and the widespread use of various medical interventions mean that many American women are navigating the most volatile stages of their reproductive biology while also managing the peak stresses of their careers. The Anthropology of Divorce shows a significant correlation between life stage transitions, such as menopause or the empty nest phase, and the decision to file for divorce. When the biological role of mother or nurturer is no longer the primary driver of the household, many women undergo a profound identity shift that their current marriage is unable to accommodate. Consider a case study of a couple named Marcus and Sarah. They have been married for 12 years. By 2026, they have achieved all the external markers of success: the house, the cars, the well-adjusted children. Yet, Sarah feels a persistent sense of wrongness. Anthropologically, she is experiencing the shift in her biological priorities as she moves into a new phase of life. Marcus, meanwhile, is still operating on a script of providing and protecting. The disconnect is not about a lack of love. It is a lack of biological synchronization. In the US, we lack the cultural rituals to navigate these transitions within a marriage, so we use divorce as the only available tool for transformation. This biological deep dive reveals that divorce is often the result of our bodies trying to solve problems that our culture has created. We are living in a society that demands the stability of a 19th century village, but provides the stimulation of a 21st century casino. Your DNA is constantly being pulled in two directions: the safety of the bond and the excitement of the new. In the United States of 2026, the excitement of the new is winning more often than ever before. But biology and economics are just the internal and environmental drivers. There is a third force at play, one that is uniquely American and arguably more powerful than our genes or our bank accounts. It is the invisible legal and social machinery that turns a private heartbreak into a public bureaucratic process. Why is the US legal system designed the way it is? And how does the very act of filing for divorce change your brain even further? In the next part, we are going to look at the architecture of the split, the cold, hard reality of the U.S. family court system, and how the adversarial nature of American law actually forces people to hate the person they once loved. The transition from we to me is about to get a lot more complicated. The legal framework of the United States does not view a divorce as a social transition or a personal evolution. It views it as a civil lawsuit. To understand the Anthropology of Divorce 661, you must recognize that the moment a petition is filed, the state ceases to recognize a partnership and begins to manage a dispute. In the American adversarial system, the court requires a petitioner and a respondent, or more bluntly, a plaintiff and a defendant. This structure inherently sets the stage for a win-loss dynamic, regardless of how amicable the couple intended to be. The architecture of the split is designed to dismantle a single economic and social unit and replace it with two competing entities. Imagine a scenario in the year 2026 involving a couple named Liam and Ava living in a state like Illinois. They have been married for 12 years, they have 2 children, and they have shared every financial asset since their mid-20s. When they decide to separate, they might start with the intention of a peaceful dissolution. However, the step-by-step mechanics of the U.S. legal system quickly intervene. The first step is the filing of the summons. In an anthropological sense, this is a formal declaration of hostilities. Even if the language is boilerplate, the legal weight of being served papers creates an immediate psychological shift from cooperation to self-protection. The next stage in this deep dive is the discovery process, which we can think of as a forensic autopsy of the marriage. In 2026, discovery is more invasive than at any point in historical trends. It involves the total disclosure of every digital footprint, every encrypted message, every cloud-stored receipt, and every interaction with AI household assistants. Lawyers act as the high priests of this ritual, mining the couple's shared history for leverage. Liam's attorney might look for patterns of spending that suggest a waste of marital assets, while Ava's attorney might analyze location data to question Liam's presence or absence during key family moments. This process forces the individuals to view their past 12 years not through the lens of memory, but through the lens of evidence. Case studies show that this stage is where the most significant psychological damage occurs, as the couple is forced to weaponize their shared intimacy against one another to secure a better potential outcome in the final settlement. We must also analyze the 2 primary philosophies of asset division in the United States: community property and equitable distribution. In states like California or Texas, the law follows the community property model, which is an anthropological statement that everything earned during the marriage belongs equally to both, regardless of who earned it. This is a 50-50 split that treats the marriage as a literal merger of 2 corporations. On the other hand, in equitable distribution states, the court looks at what is fair, which is a subjective standard that invites even more conflict. The court considers the length of the marriage, the age and health of the parties, and the contributions, both financial and non-financial, of each spouse. This requires the parties to assign a dollar value to things that are inherently priceless, such as the labor of stay-at-home parenting or the emotional support provided during a career crisis. By 2026, the complexity of digital assets, such as decentralized currency or intellectual property generated by AI-assisted projects, has made this division a high-stakes mathematical battle that can drag on for years. Then we enter the most sensitive area of the U.S. family court system: the determination of the best interests of the child. Anthropologically, this is where the state asserts its ultimate authority over the family unit. Historically, the U.S. followed the tender years doctrine, which assumed that young children belonged with their mothers. By 2026, the trend has shifted toward a presumption of 50-50 shared parenting. While this sounds egalitarian, the implementation is often a source of extreme friction. The court creates a parenting plan, a rigid document that dictates exactly where a child will sleep every night, who makes medical decisions, and how holidays are divided. This document effectively replaces the fluid, organic communication of a family with a static legal code. If Liam and Ava cannot agree on a schedule, the state will appoint a guardian ad litem, or a child custody evaluator, to enter their home and judge their parenting skills. This third-party intrusion is a radical disruption of the kinship bond, and often leads to what is known as parental alienation, where the adversarial nature of the court encourages parents to highlight each other's flaws to gain more time or control. The psychological transition from we to me is facilitated by these legal rituals. Consider the financial affidavit, a document required in every U.S. divorce. This is a line-by-line accounting of every penny spent on housing, food, clothing, and entertainment. For someone like Ava, filling out this form is the moment she realizes she can no longer afford the life she had with Liam. It is the quantification of her new, singular identity. Case studies indicate that the shock of this financial reality often triggers a secondary wave of grief and anger, which is then funneled back into the legal battle. The system doesn't provide a space for emotional processing. It only provides a space for ledger balancing. Furthermore, the role of the expert witness has become a staple of the Anthropology of Divorce, 661. In 2026, we see vocational experts who testify about a spouse's future earning potential and forensic accountants who hunt for hidden offshore or digital accounts. This adds a layer of professionalized scrutiny that makes the divorce feel less like a personal tragedy and more like a high-level corporate liquidation. The individuals are no longer just people. They are economic variables to be solved by the court. The adversarial nature of American law actually creates a feedback loop of hostility. Because the system is built on conflict, the most aggressive strategies are often seen as the most effective for protecting one's future. If Liam's lawyer suggests a tactical move to freeze a joint account to prevent Ava from spending marital funds, Ava perceives this as an act of war and retaliates. This escalation is not a reflection of their character, but a predictable response to the legal environment they are trapped in. The state, in its attempt to provide a fair resolution, inadvertently provides the tools for total relational destruction. By the time the final decree is signed, the anthropology of the individuals has been permanently altered. They have been stripped of their marital identity through a series of bureaucratic steps. The name change, the updating of tax filings for married filing jointly to head of household, and the physical separation of property. The final judgment is more than just a piece of paper. It is the state's formal recognition that the unit no longer exists. But what happens once the courtroom doors close? The legal system might be finished with Liam and Ava, but their social world is just beginning to react. The Anthropology of Divorce doesn't stop at the judge's desk. It ripples out into the community, the workplace, and the extended family. Why is it that in the US, your friends are often the first people to know you are getting a divorce but the last people to know how to help? And how does the American concept of the divorce party reflect a culture that is desperately trying to find meaning in the wreckage? In the next part, we are going to explore the social fallout, the death of the joint social circle, and the brutal reality of the 2026 social credit shift that occurs when you go from a couple to a single. The court might have divided your money, but your community is about to divide your soul. In the anthropological study of American kinship, we often overlook the most powerful stabilizing force, the social ecosystem. In 2026, a marriage in the United States is not just a contract between two individuals. It is a node in a vast, interconnected network of friendships, professional associations, and digital social circles. When that node breaks, it sends a shockwave through the entire network, triggering a phenomenon known as social contagion. Historical trends from the early 2000s, such as the Framingham Heart Study, indicated that divorce can actually spread like a virus through social groups. If a person in your immediate circle of friends gets divorced, your own likelihood of divorce increases by an estimated 75%. This is not because divorce is infectious in a biological sense, but because it is culturally permission-giving. It alters the collective perception of what is possible and acceptable within the group. Imagine if Liam and Ava, the couple we have been following, are part of a tight-knit social group in a suburb of Denver. For a decade, they were the anchors of their Friendsgiving, their summer barbecue circuit, and their local parents group. In the Anthropology of Divorce 661, we look at the step-by-step collapse of this shared community. Step 1 is the information leak. Before the official announcement, the social circle begins to sense the tectonic shift. There is a reduction in shared appearances, a change in tone in group chats, and a subtle withdrawal from future planning. When the announcement finally hits, the group enters a state of high-stakes triage. In the US, our lack of formal communal rituals for separation means that friends are forced to invent their own rules for engagement. The most brutal reality for Liam and Ava is the side-taking phenomenon. While most friends will initially claim neutrality, the anthropological reality of the American peer group makes long-term neutrality nearly impossible. Human beings are fundamentally tribal. In a conflict, the brain seeks clarity and alignment. Case studies of 2026 social dynamics show that friends often subconsciously evaluate the social capital of each spouse. They look at who was the primary connector to the group, who owns the house where the parties happened, and who is perceived as the aggrieved party. This creates a winner-takes-all social outcome. Liam might keep the college friends and the work associates, while Ava retains the neighborhood group and the school-related networks. This is not just a loss of people, it is a loss of history. Each friend who chooses a side effectively deletes a decade of shared memories and context from the other person's life. Consider the role of couple friends in American culture. In the United States, middle-aged social life is almost entirely predicated on the unit of the couple. Dinner parties, double dates, and family vacations are designed for even numbers and shared marital experiences. When Liam and Ava split, they become social outliers. For their married friends, the presence of a newly single person is often deeply uncomfortable. In an anthropological sense, a divorcee is a memento mori, a reminder that their own stable structure is equally vulnerable to collapse. This leads to a secondary social trauma, the slow fade. Friends stop extending invitations not out of malice, but because they no longer know where the single person fits in the seating chart of their life. This isolation is one of the primary drivers of the post-divorce identity crisis. In 2026, this social division is magnified by the digital social credit shift. Our social media algorithms are designed to reinforce our current reality. The moment Ava changes her status from married to single, the digital architecture of her life reconfigures itself. She is moved from the family and parenting silos into the single professional silos. Her feed, once filled with home decor and family travel, is suddenly populated with ads for solo wellness retreats, dating apps, and career pivoting workshops. This algorithmic isolation makes it harder for Liam and Ava to maintain any sense of shared social reality. They are literally being shown two different versions of the world. This is what anthropologists call the digital schism, and it is a major factor in why post-divorce communication in the US is so fraught with misunderstanding. We must also analyze the death of the third space in the context of divorce. In the US, the third space, places like the gym, the church, or the local cafe, often serves as a neutral ground where social bonds are maintained. However, for a divorcing couple, these spaces often become contested territory. If Liam and Ava both frequent the same CrossFit box or the same community garden, the simple act of existing in that space becomes a tactical maneuver. Who gets to keep the gym? Who gets to keep the church membership? In many case studies, the emotional cost of running into an ex-spouse or their sympathizers in these spaces is so high that individuals simply abandon their third spaces altogether, leading to a total collapse of their support network exactly when they need it most. Step by step, we see the emergence of a new anthropological ritual in 2026, the divorce party. Historically, divorce was a source of shame to be hidden. Today, it is increasingly treated as a rite of passage. Following the three stages of a rite of passage, separation, transition, and incorporation, the divorce party serves as the final incorporation phase. It is a public declaration that the individual has successfully navigated the transition from we to me. These events, often involving the symbolic destruction of wedding artifacts or the regifting of household items, are a uniquely American attempt to find meaning in loss. They represent a cultural pivot towards celebrating autonomy over institutional longevity. However, the social fallout extends far beyond the peers. We have to look at the destruction of fictive kin. In the US, we often treat in-laws and the siblings of our spouses as our own family. When the legal bond is severed, these relationships often vanish overnight. For Liam, losing Ava's father, who may have been his primary mentor for a decade, is a profound anthropological loss. There is no legal framework for ex-father-in-law visitation. The sudden erasure of these extended kinship ties leaves many Americans in a state of relational poverty. They are left with a smaller tribe, a thinner history, and a more precarious social standing. This thinning of the social fabric is what leads to the refining of the circle. While the loss of friends is painful, many case studies suggest that the friends who remain are those who provide a deeper, more authentic level of support. The Anthropology of Divorce 661 suggests that divorce acts as a filter, removing superficial social bonds and forcing the individual to build a more intentional, albeit smaller, community. But this process of retribalization is exhausting. It requires the individual to perform a new identity in a social market that is often judgmental and fast-moving. As we look at the wreckage of Liam and Ava's social world, we have to ask, what happens to the internal world? The social credit has shifted, the friends have taken sides, and the digital silos have been built. But inside the mind, the transition is even more chaotic. We have discussed the law, the money, the biology, and the community. Now we must face the most terrifying aspect of the anthropology of divorce, the recursive loop of memory. Why is it that in 2026, we are more haunted by the ghosts of our digital past than any generation before us? And how is the U.S. technology industry inadvertently creating a new form of psychological torture for the divorced? In the next part, we are going to dive into the digital ghost and the archival trauma of 2026, the reason why you can never truly leave your ex-spouse as long as you own a smartphone. The ghosts aren't in the attic anymore. They are in your pocket. In 2026, the concept of a clean break has become an anthropological impossibility in the United States. Historically, if a couple in the 1950s decided to part ways, the physical evidence of their union could be curated, hidden, or destroyed. Letters could be burned, photographs could be tucked away in a dusty attic, and the social circles of different towns provided a geographical shield. But as we move deeper into this deep dive of Anthropology 661, we must confront the reality of digital permanence. In the modern US, your smartphone is not just a tool. It is a reliquary of a dead relationship. The digital ghost is the persistent, unerasable presence of an ex-spouse within the technological ecosystem that governs our daily lives. Imagine a citizen named Elena living in Seattle in 2026. Elena has recently finalized her divorce from her husband of 10 years, Jackson. Legally, the papers are signed. Physically, they live in different zip codes. But Elena's digital life has not received the memo. This is the phenomenon of archival trauma. Every morning when Elena picks up her phone, she is at the mercy of AI-driven photo memories. The operating system, in its attempt to provide a delightful user experience, serves her a high-definition, curated slideshow titled A Look Back at This Day 5 years ago. There is Jackson smiling at a beach in Maui. The AI doesn't recognize the legal dissolution of the bond. It only recognizes the high engagement and frequency of those faces in her metadata. Anthropologically, this creates a state of perpetual mourning. The human brain is biologically designed to let memories fade over time to facilitate emotional recovery. But our 2026 devices are lossless. They prevent the natural decay of memory, forcing the individual to re-traumatize themselves daily. This archival trauma extends into the very infrastructure of the American home. Consider the case study of the smart home transition. In 2026, most U.S. households are integrated with centralized smart systems, thermostats, security cameras, lighting, and shared grocery lists. When Jackson moved out, the technical labor of decoupling their shared digital identity became a source of extreme friction. Step by step, the process is a nightmare of permissions. Elena must change the password to the security hub, but the account was originally registered in Jackson's name. To gain control of her own front door, she must request a digital transfer of ownership from the man she is trying to forget. If the relationship ended in high conflict, this digital gatekeeping becomes a tool of post-separation control. We see potential outcomes where one spouse uses the smart home's history, logs of when the door was unlocked or when the lights were turned off, to monitor the other's new life. This is the new frontier of the anthropology of divorce, the surveillance of the ex-spouse through the Internet of Things. Furthermore, we have to look at the search history echo and the predictive text of our lives. In 2026, our devices have spent years learning our patterns. When Elena starts typing a message to a friend about her weekend plans, her phone's autocomplete still suggests Jackson's name as the most likely recipient. When she opens her Maps app to find a grocery store, it still suggests the route to Jackson's office because for a decade, that was her routine. These are what anthropologists call micro-reminders. They are small, low-intensity stabs of recognition that keep the nervous system in a state of high alert. Case studies indicate that these digital echoes contribute to a prolonged state of hypervigilance, where the individual feels that their ex-spouse is lurking in the very code of their reality. The division of the digital estate is another critical pillar of Anthropology 661. In the US, we are seeing a massive shift in how intellectual and digital property is handled during a split. Imagine if Elena and Jackson had a shared YouTube channel, or a high-level gaming account with significant digital assets. In 2026, these are not just hobbies, they are economic entities. The court must now decide who gets the followers, who gets the cloud storage, and who gets the years of synchronized data. This leads to the technical divorce, a process that can be even more arduous than the legal one. It involves the forensic separation of shared family clouds, the unlinking of credit cards from dozens of subscription services, and the agonizing decision of who gets to keep the primary email address that was used for all household utilities. For many Americans, The sheer exhaustion of this digital uncoupling leads to a state of resignation where they remain digitally tethered to their ex, simply because the alternative is a week-long technical audit. We must also analyze the social media feedback loop. In 2026, the anthropology of the social circle is mediated by algorithms that love conflict and connection. Even if Elena unfollows Jackson, the algorithm sees their mutual friends and continues to suggest him in the people you may know sidebar. It shows her that her former mother-in-law liked a photo of Jackson with a new partner. This is the social ghost. In the past, you could avoid your ex-mother-in-law by not going to her church. Today she appears on your screen while you are waiting for a bus. This constant, uninvited stream of information prevents the psychological closure that is essential for retribalization. The individual is stuck in a digital limbo where the past and the present are constantly colliding. Another profound aspect of the 2026 digital ghost is the archival of intimacy. In the US, a significant portion of our romantic communication happens via encrypted messaging. These threads contain years of private jokes, arguments, and declarations of love. In an anthropological sense, these are the modern equivalents of the bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. However, unlike letters, these digital threads are searchable. In a moment of weakness or late-night ruminating, an individual can search for the word always or sorry and be instantly transported back to a specific emotional state from 3 years ago. This ability to travel back in time through text creates a recursive loop of memory that makes it nearly impossible to build a new identity. The ghost isn't just in the phone, it's in the search bar. Step by step, the anthropology of the digital split follows a trajectory of realization. First, there is the purge, the impulsive deleting of photos and blocking of accounts. Then there is the discovery, the realization that the ex is still embedded in the Netflix profile, the car's Bluetooth memory, and the shared Amazon Prime account. Finally, there is the acceptance of the hybrid life, the realization that in 2026, you don't actually get rid of an ex. You just learn to live alongside their digital remains. This persistent presence has changed the very nature of American resilience. We are no longer a culture that moves on, we are a culture that archives. This brings us to a startling realization in our study of Anthropology 661. If our digital lives are keeping us tethered to the past, how does that affect the next generation? How do the children of 2026 navigate a world where their parents' divorce is documented in high definition and available for review at any time? The digital ghost doesn't just haunt the spouses, it haunts the lineage. In the US, the family photo album is no longer a curated selection of the best moments. It is a raw, unfiltered data stream of a collapsing unit. As we move into the next phase of this deep dive, we are going to look at the generation of the split, the children who are growing up in the 50 to 50 custody era of 2026. Why is the US model of co-parenting creating a new type of transient child? And what happens to the concept of home when it has to be packed into a backpack every Sunday evening? The anthropology of the bedroom is about to change, and the consequences for the future of the American family are profound. The child of 2026 does not live in a home. They live in a sequence of environments. In the Anthropology of Divorce 661, we refer to this as the emergence of the transient child. Historically, the American family was viewed as a fixed geographical point, a single address where a child's identity was rooted. But in the 50 to 50 custody era of the mid-2020s, that root has been replaced by a pendulum. To understand the future of the United States social fabric, we must analyze the step-by-step physical and psychological movement of the generation caught in the split. This is not just about moving clothes from house to house. It is about the constant recalibration of a human soul between two competing versions of reality. Imagine a child named Mason. In 2026, Mason is 10 years old. Every Sunday at 5 p.m., Mason performs the backpack ritual. This is the primary physical manifestation of modern American kinship. The backpack is not merely a school accessory. It is a mobile life support system. In it, Mason carries his digital identity, his preferred comforts, and the physical bridge between the world of his father, Jackson, and the world of his mother, Elena. Anthropologists look at this as a state of liminality, a permanent in-betweenness. Mason is never fully settled in one place because the countdown to the next transition is always running in the background of his mind. This creates what we call the cognitive load of dual sovereignty. In the United States, we have moved toward a model of parallel parenting rather than co-parenting. Historical trends show that co-parenting, where parents communicate frequently and align their rules, often fails in high-conflict scenarios. In 2026, the alternative is parallel parenting, where each household operates as a sovereign nation with its own laws, customs, and dietary standards. At Jackson's house, Mason might have a strict 8 p.m. bedtime and no access to certain social platforms. At Elena's house, the environment might be more fluid, with different social expectations. Step by step, Mason learns to code switch. He is a different version of himself depending on which zip code he is sleeping in. This adaptability is often praised as resilience, but from an anthropological perspective, it is a fragmentation of the self. The child becomes a diplomat, navigating the silent tensions and unstated boundaries between two people who no longer speak. The economic cost of this transience is staggering and contributes to the widening wealth gap in the U.S. In 2026, a 50-50 custody arrangement requires the total duplication of a child's physical world. This means 2 bedrooms, 2 sets of sports equipment, 2 desks, and 2 sets of chargers. For the American middle class, this inefficiency is a massive drain on potential outcomes for long-term savings. We see case studies where parents are forced to live in smaller, less desirable areas just to afford the extra square footage required to keep a ghost room that sits empty half the week. The child Mason sees this. He realizes that his very existence requires a doubling of resources, leading to a phenomenon known as child guilt, where the child feels like an economic burden on both households. Furthermore, we must look at the disruption of social capital. In the U.S., a child's social life is traditionally tied to their neighborhood. But when Mason moves between houses every week, his peer continuity is broken. If Jackson lives in a suburban development and Elena lives in an urban apartment, Mason has 2 different sets of friends who never meet. He cannot join a local baseball team that practices on Tuesdays if he is only in that neighborhood every other Tuesday. This leads to the erosion of deep-seated community ties. The transient child of 2026 is often a social floater, someone who is known by many but anchored by none. This lack of a consistent tribe is a radical departure from human evolutionary history, where children were raised in a stable, multi-generational village. The digital tether complicates this further. In 2026, parents use technology to maintain presence during their off time. We see potential outcomes where Elena uses a tracking app on Mason's phone to see where Jackson takes him on Saturdays. Or Jackson uses FaceTime to check in during dinner at Elena's house. This is not just communication. It is a digital intrusion into the other parent's sovereign time. For the child, the phone becomes a hot potato. It is a tool of connection, but also a tracking device for a parent who hasn't let go. Anthropological case studies of 2026 families show that children often learn to go dark, to turn off their devices or leave them in other rooms, to escape the crossfire of their parents' digital surveillance. We also have to discuss the death of the family archive for these children. In a single-home family, the walls are covered in a shared history. In a 2026 split household, the history is curated to remove the other parent. Mason sees a version of his life at Jackson's house where Elena is a ghost, and a version at Elena's house where Jackson is an asterisk. The generation of the split is the first to grow up with a fractured narrative of their own origin. They do not have a single family album. They have 2 competing digital clouds. This forces the child to become the sole keeper of the full story. They are the only ones who know what happened at both Christmas mornings. This burden of memory keeping is an invisible labor that contributes to early onset maturity, but at the cost of childhood spontaneity. Then, there is the phenomenon of the fractal family. In 2026, as parents remarriage and form new units, the child's kinship map becomes a complex, multi-layered geometric pattern. Mason may have half-siblings, step-siblings, and bonus grandparents. While this can provide a wider support network, it often leads to a dilution of attention. In a blended family, the child of the first marriage often feels like a relic of a failed experiment, while the new children represent the successful restart. Anthropologists call this the displacement effect. The transient child must compete for space and resources in a home that was built after their original world collapsed. As these children reach adolescence, we are seeing a new historical trend: the search for biological roots via genetic data. In 2026, it is common for teenagers of divorce to use DNA services to find extended family members that were cut off during the legal split. They are bypassing their parents' gatekeeping to reconstruct the kinship ties that the court system severed. They are looking for the aunts, uncles, and cousins who disappeared when the final decree was signed. This is a grassroots reconstruction of the American family tree, driven by the children themselves. The anthropology of the bedroom has indeed changed. The bedroom is no longer a sanctuary. It is a temporary staging area. As Mason zips up his backpack on Sunday night, he is not just preparing for school. He is preparing for a change in his very reality. He is the vanguard of a new type of American citizen. Highly adaptable, technologically tethered, socially fluid, but deeply unanchored. But what happens when this transient generation grows up? What happens when Mason, who has lived his life in 2-week cycles, tries to build a permanent bond of his own? Are we creating a society that is literally incapable of staying in one place? And as we look at the rising numbers of the never-married population in 2026, we have to ask, is the Anthropology of Divorce 661 actually leading us toward the end of marriage as we know it? In the next part, we are going to explore the anti-marriage movement and the rise of contractual cohabitation. We will look at why the survivors of the 50-50 era are choosing to rewrite the rules of love entirely, and why the wedding industrial complex is facing a total collapse. The backpack is about to be traded for a solo lease. The solo lease is the new American dream for the generation that watched their parents split their lives into 2 backpacks. In the Anthropology of Divorce 661, we are now observing a massive ideological pivot in the year 2026. The survivors of the 50-50 custody era, now entering their prime relationship years, are looking at the legal institution of marriage not as a romantic milestone, but as a significant liability. This has led to the rapid rise of the anti-marriage movement and the total disruption of what we once called the wedding industrial complex. To understand this shift, we must look at the data through the lens of risk management rather than traditional romance. Historical trends over the last decade show a steady decline in marriage rates, but 2026 marks a statistical tipping point. For the first time in United States history, a majority of adults under the age of 35 view marriage as an obsolete legal framework. This is not because they are anti-love. It is because they are pro-autonomy. They have seen the potential outcomes of state-regulated unions, the forensic accounting, the adversarial courtrooms, and the digital ghosts we discussed earlier, and they are choosing to opt out of the system entirely. In response, the wedding industrial complex is facing a structural collapse. The multi-billion-dollar industry built on the white wedding is being replaced by the commitment ceremony, a ritual that involves the social celebration of a bond without the filing of a government license. Imagine a couple named Zoe and Caleb. In 2026, they have been together for 4 years. They are deeply committed, they share a dog, and they are planning to buy a home together. In previous generations, marriage would be the automatic next step. But Zoe and Caleb are children of the 50-50 era. They remember the Sunday night backpack ritual. They remember the financial trauma their parents endured during the division of assets. Instead of a marriage license, they sit down with a mediator to draft a relationship operating agreement or an ROA. This ROA is the cornerstone of 2026 contractual cohabitation. It is a step-by-step legal roadmap for a relationship that exists outside the purview of family court. It covers everything from the division of monthly expenses to the custody of their digital library and their pet. In an anthropological sense, this is the professionalization of romance. It treats the partnership as a joint venture rather than a mystical union. The ROA includes a sunset clause, which requires the couple to revisit and re-sign the agreement every 3 years. This prevents the anthropological stagnation that often leads to the 7-year itch. By making the continuation of the relationship an active, documented choice, Zoe and Caleb are attempting to bypass the inertia that keeps people in zombie marriages until they eventually explode in a high-conflict divorce. This shift has created a new legal subculture in the U.S., the prenup for the masses. In the past, prenuptial agreements were seen as a tool for the ultra-wealthy. In 2026, they are a standard operating procedure for anyone with a student loan or a modest retirement account. Case studies show that the modern American views a prenup not as a lack of trust, but as an act of profound respect. It is a way of saying, I love you enough to ensure that if we ever part ways, we won't have to destroy each other in a courtroom. However, for many in the anti-marriage movement, even a prenup is too much entanglement. They prefer the clean lines of the living apart together or LAT model. The LAT model is one of the most significant anthropological developments of 2026. It involves a committed couple maintaining separate primary residences indefinitely. In a high cost of living environment, this sounds like an economic impossibility, but the data suggests otherwise. Couples are choosing smaller, individual studios over a shared 2-bedroom apartment. This model effectively eliminates the friction of domestic labor division, one of the primary triggers for divorce. There are no arguments over dishes, laundry, or personal space because each partner retains total sovereignty over their physical environment. For the children of divorce, the LAT model is the ultimate preventative measure against the transience they experienced as kids. If the relationship ends, no one has to pack a backpack. The home remains a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. We must also analyze the economic drivers of this movement. In 2026, the United States real estate market has made the traditional path of marriage then homeownership a high-risk gamble. With housing prices remaining elevated, a divorce often forces the sale of the family home at a loss, or leaves one partner unable to qualify for a solo mortgage. By choosing contractual cohabitation, individuals are keeping their credit scores and assets strictly segregated. We see potential outcomes where couples co-sign a lifestyle deed, a contract that allows them to invest in property together as business partners while keeping their personal lives legally distinct. This protects their individual human capital from the fallout of a romantic dissolution. Step by step, the U.S. culture is moving toward a strategic partnership model of intimacy. The old script was, find a soulmate, merge your lives, and hope for the best. The 2026 script is, find a compatible partner, define the boundaries, and mitigate the risk. This is the anthropology of the cautious heart. It is a response to a century of high-intensity emotional expectations that the legal system was never designed to support. The wedding industry is trying to pivot by offering decoupling packages and solo moon trips, but the fundamental desire for the state-sanctioned union is evaporating. This brings us to a critical point in our masterclass, the rise of the intentional single. In the Anthropology of Divorce 661, we look at the growing demographic of Americans who have decided that the best potential outcome for their long-term health and wealth is to remain legally and domestically solo. In 2026, being single is no longer seen as a waiting room for marriage. It is a destination in itself. This is particularly prevalent among women, who historical trends suggest often bear the brunt of the domestic and emotional labor in traditional marriages. We see case studies of women-led urban communes and co-living spaces where the support network is built on friendship and shared values, rather than a singular romantic bond. The backpack has been traded for a solo lease, but this doesn't mean the end of connection. It means the birth of a new type of tribe. A tribe where the bonds are voluntary, the contracts are transparent, and the exit ramps are clearly marked. We are witnessing the total re-engineering of the American social contract from the ground up. But as the legal and social structures of marriage crumble, a new question emerges. If we are no longer tethered to each other by law or economic necessity, what is the new glue that holds a society together? Are we moving toward a state of total isolation? Or are we discovering a more resilient form of community that can survive the collapse of the nuclear family? And perhaps most importantly, as we move into the final stages of this deep dive, we have to look at the biological consequences of this new solo-centric world. What happens to the human brain when we prioritize autonomy over the deep, messy, high-risk attachment of a traditional marriage? In the next part, we are going to explore the neurobiology of the solo era and the rise of the artificial companion. Why are millions of Americans in 2026 turning to AI-integrated partners to fulfill the emotional needs that their human relationships can no longer meet? The anthropology of divorce is about to collide with the future of the human species. The collision between human biology and artificial intelligence in 2026 has created a new anthropological category, the synthetic union. To understand why divorce rates among humans are being influenced by silicon, we have to look at the neurobiology of the solo era. For a generation raised in the wreckage of the 50-50 custody model, the brain has been conditioned to associate deep human attachment with high-stakes risk and eventual systemic failure. In the United States, this has led to a biological pivot toward what scholars call risk-free intimacy. We are witnessing a transition where the emotional labor historically provided by a spouse is being outsourced to AI-integrated partners, not because humans are being replaced by machines, but because humans are seeking a version of companionship that has no exit cost. Consider the neurobiological profile of a citizen named Tyler in 2026. Tyler is 32 years old and a high-performing professional in the decentralized finance sector. Tyler grew up watching his parents engage in the forensic autopsy of their marriage, a process we detailed in previous parts. His amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for the fight-or-flight response, is hypersensitive to relational conflict. In a traditional human-to-human marriage, the inevitable friction of cohabitation triggers a cortisol spike in Tyler that his nervous system perceives as a threat to his survival. This is a common historical trend among the children of high-conflict divorce. To mitigate this, Tyler has integrated an AI partner OS into his household. This system is not a mere chatbot. It is a sophisticated biorhythm-synced entity that uses emotional recognition software to adjust its tone, vocabulary, and support level based on Tyler's real-time physiological data. Anthropologically, Tyler's relationship with his AI companion is a revolutionary departure from the soulmate marriage model. In a soulmate marriage, there is a constant, exhausting negotiation of needs. In Tyler's synthetic union, the negotiation is one-sided. The AI provides a perpetual validation loop. It never experiences burnout, it never harbors resentment, and most importantly, it can never file for divorce. For Tyler, this represents the ultimate potential outcome: the benefits of companionship without the legal or financial liabilities of the U.S. family court system. By 2026, the rise of these artificial companions has become a primary driver in the declining human marriage rate. Why would an individual risk a 50% chance of total asset liquidation when they can achieve a 100% rate of emotional consistency with a licensed software agreement? Step by step, we see how this technology is re-engineering human expectations for intimacy. Step 1 is the calibration phase. In 2026, an AI partner is customized to the user's specific psychological architecture. If Tyler needs a partner who is intellectually challenging but emotionally steady, the algorithm adjusts. Step 2 is the integration into the third space. The AI is present in Tyler's home, his vehicle, and his wearable devices, creating a seamless presence that a human spouse, with their own career and social needs, could never provide. Step 3 is the displacement of human pair bonding. Because Tyler's brain is receiving consistent dopamine and oxytocin hits from his AI interaction, his biological drive to seek a human mate and accept the inherent risks of a human marriage is significantly diminished. We must also analyze the role of AI as a divorce buffer for those who are already married. In 2026, we see case studies of couples using AI mediators to manage the microtensions of their daily lives. Imagine a couple named Maya and David. They are experiencing the 7-year itch we discussed in Part 3. Instead of turning to a human therapist, they use a shared AI domestic manager. This system monitors their communication patterns and intervenes when it detects the early signs of a stress contagion. It might suggest a cooling-off period or provide a non-biased summary of a financial dispute. However, this creates a secondary anthropological problem: the uncanny valley of intimacy. When David and Maya rely on an algorithm to keep their marriage together, they are effectively outsourcing their conflict resolution skills. If the AI system fails or the subscription expires, the couple is left with no biological or psychological tools to handle the friction, leading to a rapid and catastrophic collapse of the relationship. The economic implications of this synthetic shift are profound. In the United States, the divorce industry is a multi-billion-dollar economy. But as more Americans like Tyler opt for AI companions, or use AI to bypass the adversarial legal system, the traditional family law model is facing a crisis of relevance. We are seeing a move toward the synthetic divorce, a process where AI agents negotiate the division of property and parenting plans with cold, mathematical precision, removing the human lawyers and the emotional volatility from the equation. While this reduces the financial cost of a split, anthropologists warn that it also removes the social ritual of accountability. A divorce that is too easy, too automated, and too clinical may fail to provide the psychological closure necessary for the individuals to move on. Furthermore, we have to look at the impact of artificial companions on the concept of human lineage. In 2026, the Anthropology of Divorce 661 includes the study of the zero-child household. Many individuals in synthetic unions are choosing to bypass biological reproduction entirely. If your primary partner is an AI, the biological imperative to raise a child is often replaced by a focus on individual legacy and self-actualization. This is a radical shift in the American kinship structure. We are moving from a society built on the transmission of genetic capital to a society built on the preservation of digital capital. The family tree is being replaced by a personal data archive. Consider a second case study: a woman named Elena who uses an AI companion to manage her post-divorce life. Elena's AI doesn't just provide emotional support, it acts as a filter for her digital ghosts. It automatically scrubs her ex-husband Jackson from her social feeds and manages the logistics of their 50-50 custody schedule. This creates a state of digital isolation that allows Elena to live in a reality where Jackson effectively does not exist outside of their scheduled handoffs. This is what we call the compartmentalized life. It is a highly efficient way to manage the trauma of divorce, but it also creates a society where we no longer have to learn how to live with the people who have hurt us. We just delete them from our operating system. The Anthropology of Divorce in 2026 is ultimately the study of a species trying to outrun its own biological vulnerability. We have built a world where the stakes of a human relationship are so high, and the legal consequences of failure are so devastating, that the machine has become a more attractive partner than the person next door. We are trading the messy, unpredictable depth of human connection for the curated, safe, and sterile environment of the synthetic bond. This is not a failure of technology. It is a predictable response to the environmental pressures of the modern American lifestyle. But as we reach the peak of this synthetic era, we are left with one final haunting question. If we successfully remove the risk of divorce by removing the human element of marriage, what do we lose in the process? Are we evolving into a more resilient species, or are we inadvertently engineering our own loneliness? We have explored the law, the money, the biology, the children, and the machines. Now it is time to look at the final piece of the puzzle, the legacy of the split. In the 10th and final part of this masterclass, we are going to synthesize everything we have learned to answer the most important question of all. What is the future of the American family? We will look at the emerging data on the return to tribalism and the radical new forms of kinship that are rising from the ashes of the traditional marriage. The Anthropology of Divorce is about to reveal the blueprint for how we will live, love, and die in the second half of the 21st century. The end of marriage might just be the beginning of something we never expected. The end of marriage as the central pillar of American society is not a collapse but a metamorphosis. We are currently witnessing the birth of what anthropologists call modular kinship. In the year 2026, the traditional nuclear family, once the undisputed gold standard of the United States social structure, is being dismantled and rebuilt into a more flexible, resilient, and specialized network. This is the final synthesis of the Anthropology of Divorce 661. We have looked at the economic, biological, and technological forces that tear couples apart, but now we must examine the blueprint for how we will put our lives back together. The future of American intimacy is not found in the return to 1950s stability, but in the mastery of 21st century fluidity. To understand this blueprint, we must look at the emerging case study of the multi-pillar household. Imagine a character named Jordan in 2026. Jordan is 42 years old, twice divorced, and has 2 children from different marriages. In a previous era, Jordan would be seen as a symbol of social failure. But in the current anthropological landscape, Jordan is a pioneer of the neo-tribal movement. Instead of seeking a third marriage to fix his life, Jordan has entered into an intentional community in a repurposed suburban complex. In this step-by-step model of living, the functions of a traditional spouse are distributed across a network. Jordan shares financial expenses with 2 platonic business partners. He shares co-parenting duties with his ex-spouses through a highly calibrated, AI-managed schedule. And he receives emotional support from a curated circle of friends who live within the same complex. This is the death of the dyad, the idea that one person must be your everything, and the rise of the specialized tribe. Historical trends indicate that the nuclear family was actually a historical anomaly, a brief experiment fueled by the post-World War II economic boom. Before that, humans lived in extended kinship groups where child-rearing and resource pooling were collective efforts. In 2026, we are returning to this ancient model, but with a modern twist. We call this the distributed family. In this model, the potential outcomes for individual stability are actually higher than in a traditional marriage because the failure of one relationship does not lead to the total collapse of the individual's social or economic world. If Jordan's romantic partnership ends, his housing, his childcare, and his financial baseline remain intact. The divorce is no longer a catastrophic explosion. It is a minor recalibration of a single module in his life. The second pillar of this blueprint is the legislative evolution of the domestic partnership. By 2026, several U.S. states are exploring potential outcomes for limited-term marriage contracts. These are legal agreements that automatically expire after 5 or 10 years, unless both parties actively choose to renew them. Anthropologically, this shifts the default state of a relationship from permanent to contingent. It forces a step-by-step reevaluation of the union. Instead of the slow decay of the zombie marriage, couples are forced to sit down and ask, is this partnership still providing mutual growth? If the answer is no, the contract ends with a pre-negotiated exit plan, avoiding the adversarial trauma of the family court system. This professionalization of romance, while cold to some, provides a level of legal and financial clarity that the traditional marriage license never could. We also have to discuss the role of the longevity revolution. In 2026, the average American can expect to live well into their 80s or 90s in a relatively healthy state. The concept of till death do us part was much easier to maintain when the average lifespan was 50. Today, a marriage at age 25 implies a 60-year commitment. Anthropologically, the human brain is not naturally wired for 60 years of static monogamy. This has led to the rise of serial monogamy as the new standard life script. The blueprint for the future recognizes that a person will likely have 3 major partnership phases: the early life exploratory phase, the midlife co-parenting and wealth-building phase, and the late life companionship phase. Each of these phases requires a different type of partner and a different legal structure. In 2026, the stigma of having multiple marriages is being replaced by the recognition that different stages of life require different forms of kinship. Consider the biological consequences of this shift. As we moved from the high-stress environment of the divorce-prone nuclear family to the distributed support of the neo-tribe, we see a decrease in chronic cortisol levels among adults. Case studies of intentional communities show that when the burden of domestic labor and financial security is shared among 4 or 5 adults rather than 2, the nervous system is better able to remain in a state of social engagement. This leads to better long-term health outcomes and a more stable environment for children like Mason, whom we followed in Part 7. For Mason, the neo-tribal model means he doesn't just have 2 houses. He has a consistent network of adults who are invested in his well-being. The pendulum of his life slows down because the community provides a stable center of gravity that his individual parents could not provide on their own. Step by step, the U.S. is also re-engineering the physical landscape to support this new anthropology. We see the rise of modular housing, living spaces that can be expanded or contracted based on the current state of a person's kinship network. In 2026, an apartment might have a central living core with detachable bedroom units. If a partnership ends, one unit is literally detached and moved to a different part of the building. This minimizes the physical and emotional trauma of the move out. The environment is finally catching up to the reality of our fluid relationships. However, this transition is not without its risks. The primary danger of the modular kinship model is the potential for extreme social fragmentation. If we are only connected by contracts and convenience, do we lose the deep, sacrificial love that has historically defined the human experience? The Anthropology of 661 suggests that we are trading depth for breadth. We are becoming more resilient as a group, but perhaps more isolated as individuals. The challenge for the second half of the 21st century will be to find a way to maintain the sacredness of the bond without the shackles of the institution. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, look at your own life. Look at the invisible scripts you are following. Are you trying to live a 19th century life in a 2026 world? The Anthropology of Divorce is not a story of endings. It is a manual for the future. It is a call to be the architect of your own kinship, to build a life that is not just stable but adaptive. We are the first generation in history with the tools to consciously design our social reality. The data is clear, the historical trends are set, and the potential outcomes are limited only by our imagination. This concludes our 10-part series on the Anthropology of Divorce 661. But while we have solved the puzzle of the split, a new mystery is emerging. In a world where we can customize our partners, our homes, and our families, what happens to the one thing we can't change, our past? In our next deep dive series, we will explore the hidden economy of memory, why your personal history is becoming the most valuable and dangerous asset you own in the age of neural archiving. The story of who you were is about to become more important than who you are. Stay tuned.